Now that we did dive into data fetching, we of course also want to practice it again. So it's again project time, and we're going to dive back into that events project we worked on before, and we will move away from dummy data, which is hard coded into our pages in the end, and instead transition to data which we fetch from some data source, like a file or a database, and which we then also fetch such that sites can be statically pre-generated or server-side rendered. Because we're going to have a look at both again, we're going to practice static site generation and server-side rendering, and I will again discuss the differences and when to use which. That is also something we'll practice in this section, of course. And we are also going to revisit client-side data fetching and see when that could make sense. Now for that, I'm back in the events project as we left it. Attached you find my snapshot. And there we can spin up that development server again with npm run dev. If we then visit localhost 3000, we see our events page, and we can explore the individual events and do all those things we already practiced in the last project section. Now, up to this point, of course, all the data is in the end hard-coded into our pages. Actually, not in the page components themselves, but we have this dummy data JavaScript file which, well, holds all that data and then exposes various helper functions for retrieving that data and working with that data. And that ultimately is not really how we now want to work with that. It would be more realistic that this data, our events, are stored in some database or in some file or coming from another API. And here I want to put those events into Firebase, this dummy backend we already used in the last course section, so that we can fetch the data from there. Just so that we have an easy to use backend which exposes an API which we can query. Now I have my sales data in there from the last course section. I'm using the same Firebase project. You could of course also create a new one, just make sure that you do use the real-time database. I will continue with this one though, and I will add my events here into that same database. So for that, we can click on the plus here next to that database name and give this a name of events, this node, and then add a new nested document in there, which now has basically the event ID as a name, E1 let's say, and then we nest more data in there and we transfer the title into Firebase. So I'll give this key a name of title, and the value then is the title I had here, like this. And now I'm going to add all the other data as well, like the description. So I'll grab that description string here, give this a name of description, paste in that value, and repeat that for the location and so on. Now I don't want to bore you, so I will fast forward here. You of course can migrate this on your own. Just pause the video and migrate it until you're done. You also don't have to migrate all the data, of course, if you don't want to. I will migrate all the data though, but you can of course also speed this process up a bit and just migrate some data. Important for the images, we want to keep the paths which we used before, because I will keep the images local in the public folder. That's not super realistic, and we will re-explore image storage later again, but for the moment let's stick to this setup. So I will just keep the path which points to the locally stored images in the public folder here. So therefore here I now add is featured, set this to false, and now again I will just complete this off screen and I'm back once I migrated all the events. Okay, so I'm done. I copied over all the data here into Firebase, those three events, and therefore this is now prepared such that we can query it. That's therefore what we're going to dive in next. Now for this course section, I strongly recommend that you don't continue with me immediately, but that instead you pause and you try implementing data fetching on your own first. Go through those different pages and think about the different data fetching approaches you learned in the last lectures, in the last section. Then add the different approaches which make the most sense to you to the different pages. So look at the pages, evaluate which data fetching approach might make the most sense for the given page, and then add it. Now, once you tried this on your own, definitely go through this module together with me with these modules lectures to see how I solved this and what my reasoning was for fetching data in different ways in those different page components. Now let's start with the starting page. Here on this starting page, we want the featured events. So we need to load those featured events onto this index.js page. So into this index.js component here, this homepage component. The question now is, how do we want to load the data? Now we could do it with client-side data fetching. We could use effect with the fetch API or install and use the use SWR hook here, which we learned about. We could do that, but does this make sense? Is this the best solution here? I would argue that here we actually want to use one of the two forms of pre-rendering instead. So static generation or server-side rendering. Because the starting page, which we're looking at here, this is a page which should be understood by search engine crawlers. It's important that they are able to understand our site and, well, direct traffic to our site. And as a visitor on this page, it would also be nice if we see something instantly. It's also not likely that this data changes multiple times per second or minute even, so there isn't really a reason for loading this on the client side. It's also not some user-specific data, and it's also not data behind a login screen or anything like that. So here I would argue it makes a lot of sense to pre-render this page with some data. That then just leaves one question. Should we use get server-side props for real server-side pre-rendering, where the page is pre-rendered on the server on the fly for every request? Or do we want get static props to pre-render the page during the build process and potentially also on the server if we set revalidate to a certain value so that we have a mostly updated page? I would argue for this kind of page, we don't need server-side rendering. We don't need to pre-render it for every request. Instead, using getStaticProps makes most sense here, I would say. So we can export this async function getStaticProps here in this index.js file, get our context, though here we won't need it, so we can also omit it. And then in here, return an object with the props for this homepage component. Now the props should be an object, and in there I want to have my featured events, which now should be fetched from Firebase, not from the dummy data.js file anymore. We're past this world. Now we have the Firebase backend, and we want to fetch the data from there. Now, how do we fetch the featured events from Firebase? Actually, when it comes to querying Firebase, you can adjust the HTTP request which is being sent with some query parameters to filter the data you are retrieving. If you search for Firebase real-time database filter, you'll find this retrieving data article. And there you learn how you can adjust the URL to which you send the request with query parameters to, well, filter the data which you're retrieving. And you can filter by specific child keys, look for certain values, and so on. Now you can do that, and feel free to dive into the docs to implement it such that you do filter on Firebase side for retrieving only selected data. I will not do that here because this is not a Firebase course and it's really just a dummy backend. Instead, I will add a new file here, let's say in a helpers folder, a file which I'll name API util.js, so which has utility functions for working with an API. And in there, I will now add a function which gives me the featured events, but I will actually always fetch all events first and then filter them just here in JavaScript. Which is of course not ideal, because it means that we always fetch all the data even if we don't need it. But as I just said, that's just not the focus here. It would be very Firebase specific if we write the Firebase query logic here, and that, well, basically leads nowhere. So therefore, I'll go to dummy.js and copy the getFeaturedEvents function from there and add it here in the API util.js file. But I'll also add another function here, getAllEvents, and in there I will write the logic for fetching all events data from Firebase. So I'll turn this into an async function so that I can use async await here. I'll also convert getFeaturedEvents into an async function. And then here in getAllEvents, I will call fetch, so the built-in fetch API, which is available in the browser and thanks to Next.js also can be used inside of getStaticProps and getServerSideProps. And here we'll then send a request to this Firebase URL, so to this REST API URL, which then triggers Firebase to talk to our database here. There we want to reach out into the events node, so this node which I added here. And then because it's Firebase, we need to add .json at the end here. That's Firebase specific. Now, since we use async here, we can also await this to get our response like this without then. Under the hood, async await still uses then, but we can write it in this more convenient way here. And we can get our data by awaiting response.json. We also might want to implement error handling here, but for the moment I'll skip it. Instead here we then have the data, and as you learned in the last section, Firebase returns your data as an object. So I will transform my events here, I'll add them as an empty array, and then loop through my data, so through all the keys in data, so through all the entries in events, so these are my keys, E1, E2, and E3, and I'll loop through them, and for every key I'll push a new event into this events array, where the ID is equal to key, and where I then want to distribute all the nested data, which is stored under that key, into that events object. And to not manually write all these key value pairs, I'll use the spread operator and just copy everything from data for the given key, so from this nested object here into this object which we push onto events. That should ensure that events is an array full of objects with all these fields here and with an ID field which is E1, E2, or E3. And then I will return events here. Now overall we still return a promise here because of async, but that promise will then resolve to this events array. And in getFeaturedEvents, we can now get all events by awaiting the result of calling getAllEvents. So this function I just worked on, I call it here. Since it returns a promise, I await that promise, which I can because I added async here. Then I have all events and I return all events, filtering for the events that are featured. Again, that means that we always load all events first, but here for this demo, that is okay. Now it's getFeaturedEvents, this getFeaturedEvents, not the one from dummy data, which I want to use in Index.js. So here we want to import get featured events from, and then I'll dive into the helpers folder into API util. And now here in get static props, we can get the featured events by awaiting the result of get featured events. So of calling this function, which we just worked on, which I now imported. We can use await because that is an async function. And then it's these featured events which I'll set as a value for the featured events prop. Now we can also name this prop just events. It doesn't have to be named featured events. And with that in get static props, we return an object with our featured events in props, and the featured events ultimately are fetched from Firebase. So now in the component function here, which is executed after get static props, we now should accept props, so the props which are set by get static props. And then here we no longer need to call get featured events, and we don't want to call it here because we don't want to fetch them on the client. Instead, I just forward props.events, so my events here, to event list. And now let's see if that works. If we save that, if we go back to the starting page and reload, that's looking good. I see my events and I can still click on them. And if I reload and view the page source here, we see that the event data is actually part of that HTML file which was sent back by the server. So pre-rendering this page with the event data worked. And here we are using static generation because we're using get static props. So this applies what we learned with Firebase and with get static props to this home page. Now the starting page is working. What about the event detail page here? This page currently still fetches its data from the dummy data file. It's this event ID, this dynamic page here. And of course here we now also want to get our concrete event, the individual event for which we want to display data, we want to get that from our Firebase backend. Now for this, first of all, we can go to dummy data and copy the getEventById function and add this to the API util.js file. Export it there, but turn it into an async function. And instead of dummy events here, we again want to use all events. So just as in get featured events, I'll get access to all events, await this, and then find my single event on the, well, overall events, which I got here. Now that's step one. Step two is to use that in the dynamic event ID page. And again, the question is, how do we want to fetch the data? Now we could fetch it on the client side, but that wouldn't make more sense here than it does on the home page. It's still unlikely that it changes a lot, and this page for an individual event is even more important when it comes to search engines than the starting page. After all, it's the single event page that has all the details for an event. So this should absolutely be crawlable. We definitely want to have some data on this page right from the start. So therefore here, I definitely also want to pre-render this page with data. Again, the question is static generation with get static props or server-side rendering with get server-side props. And as often, the answer probably is get static props. Because this again is not really a page where we need user-specific data, which changes all the time, or anything like that. So pre-generating it sounds good to me. So in this event ID page here, in this page file, we therefore also want to export the async get static props function again. Here, however, we'll need the context because we'll need to know for which specific event ID we want to load the event data. So we can get the event ID from context, and there the params, and then their event ID, because this here is the identifier I encoded in the file name. This gives us access to the event ID. Once we have the event ID, we want to fetch the single event, and therefore I remove the import of getEventById from dummy data, and instead import getEventById from, going up one level and another level, helpers API util. So from this API util file which sends requests to Firebase. And now we want to use this in getStaticProps to get that single event. For this we await getEventById, because that's an async function returning a promise, and we still pass the event ID to that function, and then here in the end we'll get that event for which we're looking. Now once we get that, we can return our object as we always do with the props key, and then there my props object will have an event or selected event key, totally up to you, which holds that single event which was identified here. So now inside of my component function, we can now work with that selected event prop. So we should accept props here, and then my event here, which I use throughout this component, is actually props.selectedEvent. Now in this component function, we now no longer need to use the router, the useRouter hook, because we no longer need access to the event ID in there, because data fetching doesn't happen inside of this component function anymore. So the concrete event ID doesn't matter to us here. And if it would, we could get it from this selected event prop, because that holds the entire event which we identified. So we no longer need useRouter here, and we can therefore also get rid of the import, of course. Now with that it wouldn't work though. And do you remember why? Because this is a dynamic page, and there is an infinite amount of possible pages that could be generated. Next.js doesn't know which event IDs it should pre-generate. And as a developer, we typically also don't know that in advance. If we have a dynamic page, maybe with user-generated content, then as a developer, we also can't anticipate which IDs we'll eventually have. That's why we need another function here. We need to also export another async function, the getStaticPaths function. This function will tell Next.js for which parameter values, so for which event IDs it should pre-render this page, and for which IDs it should therefore call getStaticProps and this component function. For this, in getStaticPaths, we have to return an object with a paths key, which holds an array full of objects where we specify our param values. So the first page, which we want to generate, for example, should have a value for the event ID param of E1. That's something we could add here. And now this single page for the event with E1 as an ID would be pre-generated. But as I just said, we typically don't know all IDs in advance. So that's typically not what we want to do. Instead, we want to fetch the event IDs here dynamically as well and derive this paths array dynamically. So for this, what we can do is we can go to API util and use getAllEvents to get all events, then extract their IDs and derive the to be generated paths from that. So for this, I'll go back here to event ID, and from the helpers API util file, I will also import getAllEvents. And now here in getStaticPaths, I will have all my events here by awaiting getAllEvents. And then I'll construct my paths array by taking my events and mapping this array of events into an array of objects where every object has a params key, which holds another object, where I then set the event ID to event.id. Event is the single event for which we're going through that events array here. So now paths is exactly the kind of array we need, and hence I'll set paths equal to paths here. With that, if we save this all, if we reload this events page for event E2, we get an error regarding the fallback key. And you might remember that we need to add this fallback key to let Next.js know if there are more possible event ID values, which we did not pre-generate here, so which it should then maybe generate dynamically on the fly, or if we did specify all possible paths here. Now here I did specify all paths, so we can set fallback to false, letting Next.js know that if we try to load this page for an unknown ID, it should show the 404 page. And with that, if we set this and reload again, now it correctly loads the page for E2. And that works for the other event as well. Now if I try E5, which is an invalid ID, I get the 404 page instead, which also makes sense. So with that, we're also handling this dynamic page successfully here. Before we now also dive into the slug page and this index page here for all events, before we do that, let's pause for a second and think about the two pages we worked on. Index.js here on the root level of the pages folder and the dynamic event ID page. Maybe there's something we can optimize, or where we could at least consider optimizations. We implemented static generation on the Index.js and the event ID.js pages. Now let's take a closer look. It works, but maybe we can optimize it. For example, on the starting page, so this Index.js page, we are pre-generating this page with the pre-fetched data, so to say. But of course, this data will then only update if we build again. So if our page was deployed for a couple of hours or even days, and we have new featured events, we need to redeploy our page to reflect that latest state. That's not ideal. And one possible workaround could be to use get server-side props instead. Then, for every incoming request, we would pre-render the page again on the fly. But this would be overkill here. We don't need to pre-generate this for every request. Just a couple of times, maybe after a certain time span. And that's where we can add the revalidate key to this object which we return, side by side to the props key. And we can set this to a value of our choice, to 10 seconds, 100 seconds, 10 minutes, whatever makes sense to you. Now our events and the featured events probably don't change that often. And it's not the end of the world if we did update them and our starting page doesn't immediately reflect this. So maybe every 1800 seconds is a good time span. That means that every half hour we regenerate this page for a new incoming request. And I think that should work quite well here. With that, this page still works, but in production it would be regenerated from time to time, at most once every half hour. Now for event ID, we also could consider revalidating, because there it's similar. If the details about an event changed, we don't reflect this on our page because we never regenerate it. Again, we could use server-side rendering for that, or we add client-side data fetching so that we have some initial data and we then update this with the client-side data. But we could also go for revalidating instead here. And here I will also set revalidate to a certain interval. Now I will not go for half an hour here, because for example, if the date changes, that's more important than the general list of featured events. It's still okay if it's slightly outdated, but I want to be more accurate than on the starting page. So I'll set this, let's say, to 30 seconds, so that if a new request comes in and it's more than 30 seconds since the page was last generated, it will be generated again. I think that's a setting that makes sense here. Of course, you can also go for a different duration if that makes more sense to you though. Or alternatively, you solve this with client-side data fetching in addition to the pre-rendering here. Now I also have an optimization idea regarding getStaticPaths. Currently, we're fetching all events here. Now in our case, that's only 3 events. But on a real page, we could of course have hundreds or thousands of events. So fetching all those events to pre-generate all those pages could be a huge waste. That might really be redundant and could lead to performance issues. So in reality, we might want to just pre-render our featured events, because those are more likely to be visited because they're featured on the starting page. So therefore here, in event ID on this event ID page, instead of fetching all events and pre-rendering all the pages, all the detail pages for all events, I will instead just load my featured events and therefore import getFeaturedEvents from the API util helper file, and then just simply execute getFeaturedEvents down there. But now with that, of course, that implies that for some events, the page will not be pre-generated. So if we leave fallback set to false, we'll have an issue. If I click on some event which was not pre-generated, like this event with an ID of E1, I get a 404 error, even though we have data for this event. But we didn't define it in advance, and therefore it wasn't pre-generated. And since we tell Next.js that we did prepare all required pages here, that's what we tell Next.js with fallback false, it shows us a 404 page here. So the correct setting here would be true, telling Next.js that there are more pages than the ones we prepared here. Then it will try to dynamically generate the page if it encounters a page which was not pre-generated before. Now if we do that, it works. Now we see no event found initially until the event was fetched, because we are checking if we don't have an event, and then we show this fallback. And that's good. We should show a fallback content whilst we are waiting for the event to arrive. But here it might be better to show some loading spinner or some loading text instead of an error, because here it's now actually expected for some events which haven't been pre-generated that we don't have them right from the start. So instead of wrapping this into an error alert, I'll wrap this in a regular div instead and give that div a class name of center, which is a globally available class name defined in the globals CSS file. And I'll then say loading instead of no event found. And therefore, now if we reload, we see loading until the event is there. So that's better. Alternatively, of course, we set fallback not to true, but to blocking. In that case, Next.js will not serve anything until we're done generating this page. So if I do that and reload, then loading the page takes a bit longer, but we get the entire finished page right from the start. It's up to you which user experience you want on your page. I'll stick to this blocking approach, but you can go for either of the two. And these were a couple of small optimization steps which I did want to implement. Now with that, let's go back to the 2 remaining pages we have, maybe first to the index.js page in the events folder, and let's make sure we also pre-rendered those correctly with data which is fetched in advance. Try implementing it on your own. We'll do it together in the next lecture. So for the all events page, the question is what we want to do there. And I would say that we probably still want to statically generate this page so that we want to fetch all the data in advance with get static props. Therefore, just as before on this page, I'll export my async function, get static props, and then in there we want to get all the events and expose them through props to this all events page component. Now we do of course have this get all events function in API util, so we can utilize that and import get all events from not from dummy data, but from helpers API util. And then go down there and get access to all events by awaiting the result of get all events. And then we return an object with a props key where I have my events, which hold my events which I've fetched here. Simple like that. And now since we exposed that through props, we should expect props here and now use the events from the props. So here I'll set events equal to props.events, or alternatively we use object destructuring, which is what I will do here. Now we still need the use router hook here, because here we're not using it to fetch some ID or dynamic path segment value, but instead we're using it for programmatic navigation, which I still want to enable here. So that stays the way it is. Now we can consider revalidating this page from time to time to make sure that we pick up new events. I think that makes a lot of sense. So we should add revalidate here and then maybe set this to 60 seconds. So that every minute, if a new request is coming in, we regenerate this page. Now with that, if I reload, this again works just fine. Now it's pre-generated though, which is why in the page source we have all that event data. So that also works. Now last but not least, let's work on the slug. On this slug page, on this catch-all page. That could be a bit more tricky because here we're catching multiple dynamic segments, multiple parameters. So here on this slug page, on this catch-all page, we're currently getting the concrete path values from the router to then get the year and the month and fetch the appropriate events for us here. Now the question is, how do we want to do that in the future with our newly gained knowledge? And we have a couple of options here. We can use getStaticProps to pre-generate this. But of course, for the filtered events, we'll have a lot of different combinations of parameters. 2021 and 1 and 5 and 2 and so on. That's not necessarily an issue though, because we will have to use getStaticPaths anyways. And once we add that, we could only pre-render a couple of those combinations and not all of them. And instead then use fallback set to true or blocking. But how should we decide which paths should be pre-generated? In the end, all possible filters are equally likely to be visited. So I would have a hard time picking a couple of combinations that should be pre-generated. And pre-generating all possible combinations is also not a great option because that could be a lot of pages, especially if we have no year restriction, for example. So getStaticProps might not be ideal here. Maybe here getServer-side-props is better, so that we do indeed fetch the data on the fly for every incoming request, and we then return the page for every incoming request. So let's start with that. In this slug page, I will export an async function called getServer-side-props. And you know that here we get the context. And then here we want to return an object which is similar to the object we return in getStaticProps. with the props key, and possibly also with the not found key and the redirect key if we need it. Now here, from the context, we can get access to the params. So here we can get access to the parameters for which this page was visited. And that's good because now we basically want to repeat what we previously did in our component function. We want to get our year and month and convert that to a number and then validate it and then ultimately get our filtered events. So I will copy all that code, though we're going to edit it a bit, but I'll copy all that code and bring it down there into get server-side props. Now here, we're accessing filtered data. That should actually be our params. Because up there, filtered data is also just what we read from the router query, which are also our params when accessed through use router. So therefore here, I'll rebuild filter data and access params.slug. So we still access .slug because that is our catch-all grouping parameter name, if you want to call it like that. And that will still be an array with multiple values, and we are interested in the first two values, which should be the year and the month, which is why we convert them to numbers and then validate them down there. Now, if validation fails, however, we don't want to return JSX. That's not possible in get server-side props. We always have to return an object instead. But if the validation fails, I don't want to return a props object here or a props key. Instead here, I'll then set not found to true. I want to show the 404 page if an invalid parameter combination is passed in. We could also consider redirecting to some error page if we had one. But here we don't have one. We could add one, but I will not do it here, so I'll comment this out and instead show the 404 error page. Another alternative would be to set some props, like the has error prop, and then handle this specific prop in our component function to show an error message. And actually, since we do have that error-specific JSX code here, that might actually be the best alternative. So it's still worth knowing the other ones, but I will now not show the 404 page, but instead return my special has error prop set to true if the validation fails. So that in the component function, in this filtered events page function, we should expect props, and then down there, instead of validating our query parameters, I check if props has error is true. And if that's the case, I'll show this error message. I think that actually makes the most sense, but you can also go with one of the two alternatives I showed. Now, if we make it past this if check, we do have valid parameter values, and therefore now we want to get our filtered events. For this, I'll go to dummy data and take this get filtered events function and bring that over into API util, maybe down there. Here, we get filtered events by reaching out to dummy events and calling filter on that. Now, just as in the other functions here, I will instead now turn this into an async function, then get access to all events by awaiting get all events, and then using all events here instead of dummy events for filtering. And with that, back in this slug page, we now want to import get filtered events, not from dummy data, but from the helpers folder and the API util file. And then down there in get server-side props, we now get our filtered events by awaiting get filtered events to which we still pass this object with this data, because I haven't changed the function signature of this function. It still wants the same parameter. But we should await because this is now an async function returning a promise therefore. So that gives us our filtered events, and hence here through props, we can expose our events, our filtered events, through an events prop. And therefore back in the component function, now in there, we actually don't really need to parse the URL anymore, though I'll keep that code around for now, but I will comment it out like this. Instead, now we are already using props has error, and I now also, in addition, want to set my filtered events here equal to props.events. So this events prop, which we populate in get server-side props. With that, if we save this, if I reload this page for this kind of filter, I still get no events found. Now, if I do pick a combination that exists though, I get an error. Num year is not defined. That makes sense because down there I am constructing a date with num year and num month. And we're not having that anymore because I am not extracting it from the URL anymore. Now we could do that, but since we do get it in get server-side props anyways, we can't just expose num year and month through props to the component. So here, besides exposing the events, I'll also expose my date, and here I'll then just expose this as an object where year is set equal to num year and month is set equal to num month. And now that we expose this date prop, we can go to the component function and build a date by accessing props.date.year and then props.date.month. So these props which we just added. For that, if we save this and reload, now this gets loaded correctly. And this is now pre-rendered on the fly on the server for every incoming request, because we are using get server-side props here. And of course, again, we can see that if we inspect the page source, there the event data is part of that HTML content. And again, if I use some other filter where we don't find any events, we see that message. And if I enter something invalid here, we see the invalid filter page. And that also is pre-rendered, as you can see here. So that's how we can use get server-side props. So now we did add static generation and server-side rendering to this mini application here. What about client-side data fetching though? Do we need that as well? To be honest, in this application, I would argue that we don't really need it. But we could still add it on a page where I think that it would also be okay. And that's this filter page. There we are currently using get server-side props. That works, but I think here client-side data fetching could also be okay. By using that, the page would load a bit quicker because we don't need to pre-render it on the server, but of course therefore the data would initially be missing. So we need to show some loading state until the data is there. But I think this page would be a fine page for client-side data fetching because it might be nice to get to this page quickly. And in addition, it's not that important for search engines. I mean, this filtered list of events, that's not the main thing search engines should be crawling. For them, the featured events, all events, and the event details are more relevant. So therefore, I think we could use client-side data fetching here on that filtered events page. That does not mean that you typically replace get server-side props with client-side data fetching. It just happens to fit in quite well in this exact scenario. Therefore, in this Slug page, I'll comment this code here back in, because now for client-side data fetching, we again need access to the route parameters inside of this component function, because that is where we are going to write that data fetching code. And we definitely, for example, still need some loading state, which should eventually be displayed. Now I want to do the data fetching with this use SWR hook, which I showed you in the last course section. So I'll quit the development server temporarily, and install the SWR package, which brings us that hook. And thereafter, we can restart the development server. Now here in the Slack page, we can import use SWR from this SWR package, and then we can start using it. Here, after I got my filter data, so after I got the route parameters, I will call use SWR, and then we want to send a request. And I want to send a request to Firebase for filtered events. Now again, we can add that filtering logic with Firebase, but since it's not the focus here, I'll cheat and I will instead fetch all events and then filter here in this component, which is of course suboptimal, but good enough for this example. So therefore, again, I'll grab this link, which fetches all events, and use that as that key for use SWR. And that then, as you learned, gives us back an object where we get access to the fetched data and also to a possible error we might be getting. Now, we also still need to transform the data though. That doesn't change. This transformation still needs to be applied. So therefore, I'll copy that transformation logic and add it to this Slack page with help of useEffect, which we need to import from React. And whilst we're there, we can also already import useState because we'll need that as well. So now here, after using use SWR, I'll execute useEffect and pass an effect function to it. And as a dependency, I'll add data, because this effect should rerun whenever the data we fetched changes. Then I'll check if we do have data, because if we don't, there's nothing we need to do. And if we do have data, I want to transform it. So I paste in my transformation logic to transform the incoming data into such an events array. However, that array should not be returned here. Instead, it should be set as state. So we can register some state here, which is initially undefined, the events state, with set events as a state updating function. And then in here, I'll call set events and set this equal to my events which I have here. So to this events array, not the events state. In case this is confusing, I can also name this loaded events and set loaded events. And then down there set loaded events equal to the events array we're generating here. Now, of course, it's very possible that we don't have any loaded events, especially when this component is rendered for the first time, so before fetching data has even started. So if we not have loaded events, then I want to show this loading output here. Otherwise, we make it past this if check, and then in this case, we get the filtered year and month, we convert that, and we can then use that data to extract just the events which we want to display here. Again, that is suboptimal. Normally, we would want to fetch just the right events, but since this would be very Firebase specific, we're going to go with this approach here. So therefore here, I then want to use my filtering logic here from inside the getFilteredEvents function in API util, copy that over and add it here so that I have my filtered events here. And instead of all events, that's loaded events. So this state we just added, that will then filter the events appropriately. However, here, I don't want to compare this with year, but with num year, and here with num month. So with these two constants. Now we get the filtered events. Props has error will never be a thing since we're not using server-side rendering anymore, which is where this prop was coming from before. Now we won't use that anymore. I'll soon remove it. So that's no longer something we should check. Instead here, I want to bring back this if check, which we outsourced to get server-side props, since we're moving back to client-side data fetching, I'll bring it back onto the client side. So this is my if condition now, like this. And it might make sense to check this before we try to filter. So I'll grab this code here and actually check this here before we derive the filtered events. So if we make it past this check, we can filter for events. We no longer need that line now. And then we check if we do have filtered events, or to be precise, if we don't have filtered events, in which case we show this fallback. And otherwise, we still want to display the filtered events. And down there, we can now again use num year and num month, since I brought back those values here. So with all of that, we should be fetching the data on the client side with the use SWR hook. Now here we might have an error, so that's also something, this error, this HTTP error, which we might be getting, which we should consider. And I'll simply check here, or if we have an error, then I want to show this error output. Of course, you could also handle it separately. And with all that added, we brought client-side data fetching back. And that means, of course, that we should now remove get server-side props. Having both together doesn't make a lot of sense. It can make sense to have get static props with client-side fetching, so that you have some pre-rendered page and you then update it with client-side fetching. But get server-side props and client-side fetching makes no sense, because get server-side props is re-executed for every request anyways. So you are guaranteed to have the latest data there. So if you use client-side data fetching, as we are doing it here, it makes no sense to use that in conjunction with get server-side props. At least not if your concern is having up-to-date data. It could make sense if you need to look into request headers or anything like that, but we're not doing that here, so we can comment this out. And with all that, if we save all the code again, if I reload this page here for a filter where I have no events, I see that. If I enter something invalid, I see that. And if I do set a valid filter, I see that. And if I reload, I see loading and that. And of course, if we now inspect the page source, this page is now missing the event data. Instead, it only contains that loading text. Because when it was pre-rendered, we didn't pre-fetch the data, we didn't prepare the data for the pre-rendering, since I commented out get server-side props. And therefore, all Next.js saw when it pre-rendered this page was in the end this loading state. This here. Because we don't have any loaded events the first time this component is rendered by Next.js. Now, as explained, using client-side data fetching is totally optional here. There's nothing wrong with get server-side props, but now we also saw that in action again, and therefore hopefully it's now clear how those different data fetching approaches work and when you might want to consider using which. So now in this module, we again applied what we learned about data fetching to our events project. And we saw get static props in action again, also with the revalidate option to make sure that this is regenerated from time to time after deployment. We also saw it in action on the dynamic page in conjunction with get static paths, which you need then, also with the fallback option, so that we don't need to prepare all possible instances of this page in advance. And we also saw get server-side props in action, which we then, however, replaced with client-side data fetching to practice this again as well. And therefore, you now know all the key data fetching mechanisms you can use in Next.js. You also learned that you can combine some, for example, client-side data fetching and static generation. You saw that in the previous course section. And therefore, you now have all the tools you need for building truly dynamic Next.js applications, where you have pages which are defining your route structure, and where in the pages you can then pre-render those pages with the data those pages might need. if any. Therefore, this was another important practice module, and we're now ready to dig deeper into Next.js.